When the fight broke out between King and Scout, I didn't think much of it at first. Dogs are dogs. I figured territorial and protective. King, my chocolate-colored Labrador, had always been friendly, but Scout, the golden retriever from across the street, had been acting out lately. Scout's owner, Mr. Hensley, seemed embarrassed as we separated the dogs in the middle of our quiet cul-de-sac. The shouting began soon after. At first, it was just angry words between me and Hensley about who was at fault. "You need to control that mutt," he yelled, pointing an accusatory finger at King. My voice rose in defense. "Control your dog." King wasn't the one who started it. Neighbors came out to see what the commotion was, and soon the block was buzzing with opinions. The division started subtly, a neighbor murmuring to Hensley, "It's always the same, isn't it?" Others avoided eye contact with me as I walked King later that week, whispering as I passed. I didn't understand what was happening at first, not until I overheard someone muttering at the grocery store, "It's not just the dog, it's him." The realization hit like a slap. This wasn't about the dogs. It wasn't even about the fight. It was about me, about the color of my skin, and by association, King's too. Hensley had turned this minor squabble into a campaign against me, framing me and King as troublemakers. Neighbors who'd once been polite became distant. Little things escalated: a rude note left on my car windshield, a false report to animal control about King being aggressive. What began as a dogfight was spiraling into something darker. The cul-de-sac, once a safe haven, felt like enemy territory. As tensions grew, lines were drawn, neighbors chose sides, and alliances formed, not because of our pets, but because of a deep-seated prejudice bubbling to the surface. I knew this wasn't just about proving King's innocence anymore. It was about standing up for myself, for my dignity, and for the right to belong in a neighborhood where I'd lived for years. The first time I truly understood how far things had gone, I was out on my usual evening walk with King. The neighborhood's Christmas lights twinkled faintly under the cold December sky, casting a picturesque glow over the cul-de-sac. It should have been peaceful, but the air felt heavy, thick with tension I couldn't quite name. As we approached the park at the edge of the neighborhood, I noticed a group of familiar faces: Hensley and a few of the neighbors standing in a loose circle. Their voices carried over the cold air. "That dog's dangerous," Hensley said, his voice loud and full of conviction. "And what's worse, he's walking it right here, like nothing's happened. Someone's going to get hurt." I froze. They didn't see me yet, but their words cut deep. I wanted to confront them, but what could I say? Instead, I turned around and took a different path home. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. How had we gone from a minor spat to this? The answer came a few days later when I noticed the flyer stapled to the community bulletin board by the park entrance. "Protect our neighborhood." It read in bold letters, with a list of vague accusations against dangerous dogs and irresponsible owners. At the bottom was a call for a meeting at Hensley's house. I didn't need to read between the lines to know it was about me. The meeting happened on a Thursday evening. I stood at my window, peering out into the darkness as neighbors trickled toward Hensley's house. People I'd exchanged friendly nods with for years were now marching into his living room, carrying plates of cookies and casseroles like it was some sort of social event. I felt powerless, but I wasn't about to let them decide my fate without a fight. The next day, I confronted my closest neighbor, Mrs. Green, who had always been kind to me. "I saw you at the meeting last night," I said, trying to keep my tone even. She looked away, fiddling with the hem of her sweater. "Oh, it wasn't anything serious. Just a chance to discuss the, situation with the dogs, Mrs. Green," I said, my voice firm. "This isn't about the dogs, is it?" She hesitated, then sighed. "Look, it's not personal, okay? People are just worried. Hensley's stirring things up, and you know how folks get around here." I didn't know it angered me more, her complacency or her refusal to admit what this was really about. The next few weeks were a blur of small, calculated acts of hostility. King's water bowl was knocked over one morning. The ceramic dish shattered on the sidewalk. My mailbox was stuffed with anonymous notes demanding I take my mutt and leave. Someone even filed a noise complaint with the city, claiming King barked all night, which was laughable. He was the quietest dog I'd ever owned. But it wasn't just me and King. The neighborhood itself began to fracture. Not everyone was on Hensley's side. Some neighbors openly defended me, pointing out how absurd it was to demonize a man and his dog over a petty dispute. "It's not right," said Mr. Lopez, who lived 2 houses down. He stopped by one evening to check on me. "I've seen King. He's a good dog, and you're a good man. Don't let them bully you." His words gave me a flicker of hope, but they also revealed something bigger. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was about the neighborhood as a whole. One morning, as I sipped coffee on my porch, a young woman named Carla approached me. She lived on the far side of the cul-de-sac and usually kept to herself. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she began, shifting nervously. "About everything that's been happening." I raised an eyebrow. "Why are you apologizing? You haven't done anything." "I haven't stood up either," she admitted. "I've been quiet, and that's the same as taking Hensley's side." She hesitated, then added, "The way they're treating you, it's not okay. If you want, I'll help you push back." Her words were a lifeline. Until then, I'd felt like it was me against the entire neighborhood. Knowing I had even a small group of allies made the burden a little lighter. As Christmas approached, the neighborhood seemed to grow colder, despite the festive decorations. Tensions reached a boiling point one evening when I found Hensley on my lawn, shouting loud enough to draw a crowd. "This isn't about race, it's about safety," he yelled, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "We don't need people like you endangering our community. People like me," I said, stepping closer. "Let's not pretend this is about my dog, Hensley. You've made it clear what you really mean." The crowd murmured uneasily. Some neighbors nodded in agreement, while others looked away, avoiding eye contact. That moment marked a turning point. I realized that to win this battle, I needed more than words. I needed to show the neighborhood the truth, not just about King, but about the kind of person Hensley was. The confrontation on my lawn might have been the first time the neighborhood saw Hensley for what he really was, but it didn't stop him. If anything, it seemed to embolden him. The very next day, I found another flyer taped to my door. This one wasn't about dogs, it was about me. "Ask yourself," it read, "do you know who's living next door? Do you feel safe with them in our community?" It was vague, but the insinuation was crystal clear. I held the paper in my hands, anger boiling beneath the surface. I thought about tearing it up, but then I realized this wasn't just hate, it was a tactic. Hensley wanted me to lash out, to give him more ammunition for his campaign. So I did the opposite. I folded the flyer neatly and tucked it into my pocket. That evening, I called Carla and Mr. Lopez. "We need to do something," I told them. "Hensley's not just targeting me. He's dividing the entire neighborhood." Carla agreed. "People are scared to speak up because they don't want to become his next target. But if we can get enough of them on our side, maybe we can stop this." Lopez nodded. "He's been using fear to control people. We need to fight back with the truth." We decided to hold our own meeting, but not in secret like Hensley's. This would be open, honest, and focused on unity. We put up flyers around the neighborhood inviting everyone to a community discussion at the park. The theme was clear: a neighborhood united. When the day arrived, I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me worried no one would show up, but as I walked toward the park with King by my side, I saw a small crowd gathering near the benches. Carla and Lopez were already there, greeting people as they arrived. By the time we started, there were about 20 neighbors present, far fewer than Hensley's gatherings, but enough to give me hope. I stood in front of the group, nerves tightening in my chest. Public speaking wasn't my strong suit, but this was too important to let fear hold me back. "I want to thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I know things have been tense lately, and I know I'm not the only one who's felt it, but this isn't who we are. This neighborhood used to be a place where people looked out for each other, where we celebrated together and helped each other through hard times." I paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm not here to talk about dogs. This isn't about King or Scout or any other pet. This is about how we let one incident spiral into something ugly. And I think we all know why. The crowd was silent. Some people looked uncomfortable, while others nodded in agreement. Division is easy, I continued. Fear is easy. But community? That takes effort. It takes courage. And right now, we need courage more than ever. Carla stepped forward next. She spoke about how she'd felt pressured to stay silent, how she'd seen the hurtful things happening, but hadn't known how to help. It's time to stop letting one man's anger control us, she said, her voice firm. We need to stand together, not against each other. One by one, other neighbors began to share their thoughts. Some admitted they'd been swayed by Hensley's rhetoric at first, but had started to see through it. Others expressed frustration at how quickly things had escalated. The turning point came when Mrs. Green, the same neighbor who'd avoided me weeks earlier, stood up. I've lived here for 30 years, she said, her voice trembling slightly. And I've seen this neighborhood at its best and its worst. What's happening now? This is the worst, but I want to make it better. She turned to me and added, I'm sorry for not standing up sooner. The meeting ended with a sense of cautious optimism. We didn't have all the answers yet, but we had a plan. Carla suggested creating a neighborhood committee to address conflicts openly and fairly, and several people volunteered to join. Lopez offered to organize a holiday block party to bring everyone together, something we hadn't done in years. As the crowd dispersed, a few neighbors approached me to apologize for their silence or their actions. It wasn't easy to hear, but I could see they were sincere. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could turn this around. But Hensley wasn't going to back down quietly. The next day, as I walked King past his house, he stepped out onto his porch, arms crossed and a smirk on his face. Nice little speech last night, he called out. But don't think for a second that this is over. I didn't respond. Instead, I met his gaze, letting him see the resolve in my eyes. This wasn't just about proving him wrong anymore. This was about reclaiming the soul of the neighborhood. The next week, the neighborhood committee began to take shape. It wasn't just about addressing the current tension. It was about creating a space where people felt heard, where disagreements didn't spiral into division. Carla spearheaded the effort, reaching out to those who hadn't attended the meeting and convincing them to get involved. Even Mrs. Green, hesitant at first, took on a leadership role. But as our plans gained traction, the opposition became more aggressive. One evening, just as I was sitting down to dinner, there was a loud knock at the door. When I opened it, a city official stood on the porch, clipboard in hand. Good evening, she said curtly. We received multiple reports of your dog being a safety concern. I'm here to follow up. My stomach dropped. King? He's not dangerous, I said, my voice firm. Who made these reports? She glanced at her clipboard but didn't answer. I'm just here to perform an inspection. If there's any evidence of aggression, there may be grounds for removal. I invited her in, my hands shaking slightly as I called King over. He trotted up, tail wagging, his usual gentle demeanor on full display. She watched as he obeyed commands, licked her hand when prompted, and sat calmly at my feet. I don't see any issues here, she admitted reluctantly, but the complaints are piling up, and that could lead to a formal hearing. As she left, I stood on the porch, seething. It was clear Hensley was behind this. He wasn't just trying to drive me out of the neighborhood. He was trying to take King away from me. The next day, I decided to take the fight to him. With Carla and Lopez's help, I began digging into Hensley's past. It wasn't hard to find cracks in his image. He had a reputation for stirring up trouble, petty disputes with past neighbors, complaints filed against him for noise violations, and even a few small claims lawsuits. But the most damning discovery came from an old newspaper article Lopez found online. It was from years ago, detailing an incident in another neighborhood where Hensley had lived. The article described a pattern eerily similar to what we were experiencing now: disputes over property lines, accusations against a family of color, and eventual gentrification that conveniently forced them out. This isn't new for him, Carla said as she read over the article. He's done this before. He moves in, creates chaos, and pushes people out to make room for his kind. It wasn't just personal, it was a pattern. And now we had proof. Armed with this information, we decided to bring it to the neighborhood. At the next committee meeting, I stood before the group, holding a stack of printouts. "I want you all to see something," I began. "This isn't the first time Hensley has targeted someone like me." I passed the articles around, watching as the neighbors read in silence. Gasps rippled through the group, followed by murmurs of shock and outrage. Mrs. Green was the first to speak up. "I can't believe this. We let him manipulate us, and now it's clear he's been doing it on purpose." But not everyone was convinced. "Maybe he has a past," said Mr. Wallace, one of Hensley's few remaining supporters. "But that doesn't mean he's wrong about the dog. We still have to consider the safety of our community. It's not about the dog," Carla shot back. "It's never been about the dog. It's about fear, and he's been feeding it to you." Despite the growing support, Hensley wasn't going down without a fight. A few days later, he called an emergency neighborhood meeting at his house, inviting only those he knew would back him up. I wasn't invited, but Lopez managed to get in, posing as a neutral party. When he returned, he was pale. "Hensley's planning to escalate," Lopez said, his voice low. "He's gathering signatures for a petition to have you removed from the neighborhood entirely. He's claiming you're a disruptive influence." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about my dog or my house anymore. It was about my right to exist in this community. That night, as I lay awake, the weight of the situation bore down on me. Every time I thought we were making progress, Hensley found a way to strike back. But this time, I wasn't going to let him win. The next morning, I called Carla and Lopez. "If he wants a fight, we'll give him one," I said. "But we're going to do it the right way, no underhanded tactics. No lies. We're going to show this neighborhood who Hensley really is." We began organizing a public forum, inviting not just the neighbors, but also local media. If Hensley wanted to make this a spectacle, we'd make sure everyone saw the truth. The forum was set for the following Saturday. As the day approached, I noticed a shift in the neighborhood. People who'd once avoided me started waving again. A few stopped by to ask how they could help. Even Mrs. Green offered to bake cookies for the event. But as hopeful as I felt, I couldn't shake the nagging fear that Hensley had one more trick up his sleeve. Saturday dawned cold and overcast, the kind of weather that made people want to stay inside. Despite my nerves, I found myself hoping for a strong turnout. If the neighborhood forum failed, Hensley would only grow bolder, and I couldn't afford to lose this fight, not for myself, not for King, and not for the community. Carla and Lopez arrived early to help set up. We'd chosen the park as our venue, setting up folding chairs under the pavilion and a small table for refreshments Mrs. Green had prepared. To my surprise, the space started filling up well before the scheduled time. Neighbors came in pairs and small groups, some curious, others resolute. A few even brought their dogs, letting them sniff around while they mingled. Hensley wasn't there yet, but I knew he wouldn't miss an opportunity to defend himself. As the forum began, I stepped up to the microphone, my heart pounding in my chest. Carla stood off to the side, giving me an encouraging nod. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "This neighborhood has always been a place I've called home, a place I believed was built on trust and mutual respect. But over the past few weeks, I've seen that trust erode, and I think we all know why." I paused, scanning the crowd. Some faces were impassive, others looked away, but a few nodded, their expressions serious. This isn't just about a disagreement over dogs. It's about fear that's been weaponized to divide us. And I want to show you exactly how that's happened. Carla took over, distributing copies of the articles Lopez had found about Hensley's past. The crowd murmured as they read, expressions shifting from curiosity to shock. "I don't want to believe this," said Mr. Wallace, one of Hensley's remaining supporters. "But if it's true," he trailed off, his voice heavy with doubt. "It is true," Carla interjected. "Hensley has a pattern of targeting people he sees as different. This isn't about safety, it's about control. He's done it before, and he's doing it again. The tension in the air was palpable when Hensley finally arrived. He walked into the pavilion with a swagger, flanked by a handful of his staunchest supporters. "Ah, so this is the smear campaign I've been hearing about," he said loudly, his voice dripping with mockery. Digging up my past to distract from the real issue, I stepped forward, meeting his gaze. "The real issue is that you've been using fear and lies to turn this neighborhood against me. Against anyone who doesn't fit your idea of what this community should look like," Hensley scoffed. "Nice try. But let's not pretend your dog hasn't been a problem. I'm just looking out for everyone's safety." Lopez spoke up from the crowd. "King isn't the problem, Hensley. You are. This has nothing to do with safety and everything to do with your own prejudice." For the first time, Hensley faltered. His eyes darted around the crowd, searching for allies, but many of his usual supporters looked uncomfortable, avoiding his gaze. As the discussion continued, more neighbors began to speak out. "I've lived next to King for years," said Mrs. Green, standing up from her seat. "He's never caused a single issue. But I can't say the same about you, Hensley. You've been stirring up trouble since the day you moved in." "Exactly," added Mr. Lopez. "You filed noise complaints about my kids playing outside last summer. You tried to get the Johnsons fined for their fence being too high. This isn't about safety, it's about control." Hensley's face turned red. "I'm just trying to maintain standards," he snapped. "Is that such a crime?" "No," I replied calmly, stepping forward. "But targeting people and spreading lies to isolate them? That is." As the conversation continued, the tide began to shift. More neighbors shared their frustrations with Hensley's behavior, and those who'd been on the fence started to see him in a new light. By the end of the forum, it was clear that his support had dwindled significantly, but Hensley wasn't ready to give up. "You can all turn against me if you want," he said, his voice bitter. "But don't come crying to me when that dog hurts someone, or when this neighborhood goes downhill because you refuse to set boundaries." He stormed off, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. After he left, Carla approached me with a hopeful smile. "I think we did it," she said. "I hope so," I replied, though I knew this wasn't over. Hensley might have lost his immediate support, but he was resourceful, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he still had something up his sleeve. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift. People who'd once avoided me started to reach out, offering apologies and words of encouragement. Even Mr. Wallace stopped by to say he'd been wrong to support Hensley. But just as I started to feel a sense of relief, I received a letter in the mail. It was from the city council, notifying me of a formal complaint filed against King, citing him as a public safety threat. My hands shook as I read the letter. Attached was a petition with over a dozen signatures, just enough to trigger a hearing. At the bottom of the page, Hensley's name stood out in bold letters. The letter from the city council changed everything. It wasn't just about the neighborhood anymore. Hensley had taken the fight to an official level. If I couldn't prove King was innocent, I could lose him for good. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of me, with Carla and Lopez sitting across from me. Their expressions mirrored my own shock mixed with anger. "This isn't just petty drama anymore," Carla said, her voice low but firm. "He's playing hardball, and he's dragging the city into it," Lopez added. "But there's no way King's a threat. Everyone who knows him can vouch for that." "That's not enough," I replied, frustration seeping into my voice. "Hensley's building a case with lies and exaggerations. I need more than character witnesses. I need undeniable proof." The first step was to figure out exactly what Hensley had claimed. According to the letter, he'd accused King of being aggressive and uncontrollable, citing multiple incidents where he allegedly lunged at other dogs or frightened children. None of it was true, of course, but the burden of proof was on me. To make matters worse, the petition wasn't signed just by Hensley's closest allies. A few other neighbors' people I hadn't expected had added their names. I couldn't understand why until Lopez brought up an important point. "They probably signed because they're scared," he said. "Not of King, but of Hensley. He's been manipulating people this whole time." Carla nodded. "Fear is a powerful tool, but we can use the truth to fight back." We decided to gather evidence to clear King's name. Carla suggested installing a small camera on King's leash during our walks to show his behavior in real time. If he's as calm and well-behaved as you say, and I know he is, it'll prove that these accusations are baseless, she said. Meanwhile, Lopez offered to talk to the neighbors who had signed the petition. If we can get a few of them to admit they were pressured into signing, it'll weaken Hensley's case. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. I took King on longer walks than usual, recording every interaction. He sniffed at bushes, wagged his tail at passing dogs, and gently approached children who wanted to pet him. The footage was clear. King wasn't just harmless, he was a model pet. Lopez, on the other hand, faced more resistance. Some neighbors refused to talk to him, their faces tight with fear when he brought up Hensley. Others were more forthcoming. I didn't want to sign, admitted Mrs. Connolly, an elderly woman who lived near the park. But Hensley came to my door and told me if I didn't, I'd regret it. I didn't know what else to do. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Just as things seemed to be turning in our favor, a new challenge emerged. One morning, I found a fresh set of flyers scattered across the neighborhood. These weren't just about King, they were about me. Do you know who your neighbor really is? The flyer read, followed by twisted half-truths about my life. It mentioned my job, my background, even my finances, painting me as an irresponsible and untrustworthy person. Carla was furious when she saw it. He's attacking your character now, she said, crumpling the paper in her fist. This is beyond low. I felt exposed, as if Hensley had pulled back a curtain on my life for the whole neighborhood to see. But instead of breaking me, the attack only strengthened my resolve. The next neighborhood committee meeting became a battleground. Hensley showed up uninvited, smug, and defiant. Let's not pretend this isn't exactly what it looks like, he said, waving one of his flyers in the air. You've been disrupting this neighborhood from the start, and now you're trying to make me the villain for pointing it out. I'm not disrupting anything, I replied calmly. I'm fighting for my place in a community I've called home for years. You're the one who's been spreading lies and tearing people apart. The room was split. Some neighbors looked uncomfortable, clearly realizing the depth of Hensley's manipulations, while others muttered in agreement with him. After the meeting, Mrs. Green approached me, her expression serious. Hensley's not going to stop, she said. If you're going to beat him, you'll need more than evidence, you'll need support. And I think I know how to get it. She explained her plan, organizing a public event to show the true spirit of the neighborhood, a holiday festival, complete with food, games, and a showcase for local pets. If people see King for who he really is, and see you as part of this community, it might be enough to sway them, she said. I hesitated, unsure if a festival could change minds. But Carla and Lopez were enthusiastic. It's perfect, Carla said. This isn't just about defending yourself, it's about bringing the neighborhood back together. The festival was set for the following weekend. As preparations got underway, I noticed more neighbors starting to come around. A few even offered to help, baking treats or setting up decorations. Hensley, of course, tried to sabotage the event, claiming it was an attempt to distract from the real issue, but the more he protested, the more isolated he seemed. The day of the festival finally arrived, bringing a mix of anticipation and anxiety. It was a chance to show the truth, to rebuild trust, and to expose Hensley's lies once and for all. The morning of the festival dawned with a rare winter sunshine, melting away some of the tension that had been hanging over the neighborhood. Carla and Lopez arrived early to help set up, and soon the park pavilion was alive with activity. Tables were laden with baked goods, children's crafts, and even a best-dressed pet contest featuring dogs decked out in holiday sweaters. King sat by my side, wagging his tail as neighbors trickled in. He had become the quiet centerpiece of this entire saga, a symbol of the fight against fear and division. But as the festival began, I couldn't shake the unease in my chest. Hensley hadn't shown up yet, and I knew he wouldn't sit back quietly while the community started to rally around me. By midday, the park was bustling with families. Children ran between booths, their laughter mingling with the cheerful sound of holiday music. Mrs. Green was running a hot cocoa stand, smiling warmly as she handed steaming cups to neighbors. It's a good turnout, Carla said, stepping up beside me. People are starting to see the truth. I nodded, but my attention was pulled toward the edge of the park, where Hensley had just arrived. He wasn't alone. He'd brought a small group of his staunchest supporters, and they stood together like a dark cloud against the bright atmosphere of the festival. Hensley didn't approach me directly, but his presence was impossible to ignore. He wandered between booths, loudly commenting on how irresponsible it was to host an event like this in the midst of a neighborhood conflict. Everyone's pretending there's no issue here, he said to a group of neighbors near the pet contest booth. But when that dog snaps, don't say I didn't warn you. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. King, sensing my tension, pressed against my leg, his warm presence grounding me. Lopez approached, his expression tight with anger. He's trying to poison the mood, he said. We can't let him ruin this. We won't, I replied. People can see through him. Let him dig his own grave. As the afternoon wore on, something unexpected happened. Neighbors who had been on the fence began approaching me not with accusations, but with apologies. I'm sorry for signing that petition, said Mrs. Connolly, her voice trembling. Hensley made it sound like it was for the good of the neighborhood. I didn't realize what he was really doing. Another neighbor, Mr. Wallace, stepped up next. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, he said, and I was wrong to believe Hensley. Seeing King here today, he's nothing like what we were told. Each apology chipped away at the wall of isolation Hensley had built around me. The most emotional moment of the day came when a little boy, no older than 7, approached King with his mother. Can I pet your dog? He asked shyly. Of course, I said, crouching down to meet his gaze. King wagged his tail enthusiastically, lowering his head as the boy reached out. His mother watched nervously at first, but when she saw how gentle King was, her expression softened. I've been hearing a lot about your dog, she said, standing a little straighter. But seeing him like this, I think I made a mistake. You're not the only one, I said gently, offering her a small smile. By late afternoon, it was clear that the festival had been a success. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in weeks stopped by to chat, their walls of mistrust beginning to crumble. Even Mrs. Green, who had been hesitant to get involved at first, seemed more confident as she rallied others to help clean up. But Hensley wasn't ready to concede. As the festival began to wind down, he finally approached me, his face a mask of anger and frustration. You think this little show changes anything? He sneered. You can fool these people for now, but I'll make sure the city sees the truth. I met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. The truth is already out there, Hensley. People are starting to see it for themselves. The more you fight this, the more they'll see who you really are. His lips curled into a bitter smile. We'll see about that. After he stormed off, Carla joined me, her expression wary. What do you think he's planning? Something desperate, I said, but we're ready for him. We've got the footage of King, the statements from the neighbors, and the evidence of his past behavior. He can't hide anymore. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Hensley had one final card to play, and that he'd do whatever it took to win. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a warm golden glow, I felt a flicker of hope. The festival had shown the best of what our neighborhood could be, a community built on connection and understanding. But the fight wasn't over yet. The hearing with the city council loomed on the horizon, and I knew it would be the ultimate test not just for me and King, but for the future of the neighborhood. The festival had been a turning point, but the sense of victory was fleeting. 2 days later, I received a notice from the city council confirming the date of King's hearing. It would take place in a week, and the stakes were higher than ever. If Hensley succeeded, I could lose not only King, but also my standing in the neighborhood for good. Carla and Lopez wasted no time helping me prepare. We gathered all the evidence we'd compiled, the video footage of King's calm behavior, statements from neighbors who retracted their signatures on the petition, and documentation of Hensley's history of harassment. Still, something gnawed at me. Hensley was relentless, and I knew he wouldn't come to the hearing without a plan. I needed to understand his next move before he could execute it. That's when Carla had an idea. We need to know what he's going to say, she said as we sat in my living room, surrounded by piles of papers and notes. If we can anticipate his arguments, we can counter them. But how do we do that? I asked. Carla exchanged a glance with Lopez, who hesitated before speaking. It's risky, but I might be able to get someone in his camp to talk. He's losing support, and I think a few of his allies are having second thoughts. Are you sure that's a good idea? I asked, my voice tinged with doubt. If Hensley finds out, it could backfire. It's worth the risk, Lopez said firmly. We can't let him blindside us. The next day, Lopez reached out to one of Hensley's remaining supporters, a man named George who lived 3 houses down from me. George had been vocal at the beginning of the conflict, but his involvement had waned after the festival. Lopez invited him for coffee, framing it as a chance to discuss the neighborhood's future. At first, George was cagey, reluctant to reveal much about Hensley's plans. But as the conversation progressed, Lopez carefully steered the discussion toward the hearing. Look, I don't agree with everything Hensley's doing, George admitted, stirring his coffee nervously. But he's determined. He says he has something that'll seal the deal at the hearing. Something no one will be able to argue against. Lopez leaned forward, his tone calm but urgent. Did he say what it was? George hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if worried someone might overhear. He mentioned a video. Said it proves everything he's been saying about King being dangerous. When Lopez relayed this information to me and Carla, my heart sank. A video? King had never acted aggressively in his life, but I knew how easily footage could be manipulated or taken out of context. We need to get our hands on that video, Carla said, her voice firm. If it's fake, we'll expose it. If it's real, we need to understand the context. How? I asked. Lopez sighed. George might be able to help. He's already nervous about being involved in this. If we push a little harder, he might tell us more. Lopez met with George again the next evening, this time at the park. Under the guise of a casual chat, he pressed for details about the video. Eventually, George caved. I haven't seen it myself, he admitted, but Hensley claims it shows King lunging at another dog. He says it happened months ago, back when you two first moved into the neighborhood. Lopez relayed this to me later that night, and I felt a mix of anger and confusion. That never happened, I said, shaking my head. King's never lunged at another dog in his life. Then it's either fabricated or heavily edited, Carla said. And if we can prove that, it'll destroy Hensley's case. To get ahead of the situation, I reached out to the city council, requesting access to any evidence Hensley planned to present at the hearing. Legally, both parties were required to disclose their materials beforehand, and I wanted to see that video for myself. 2 days later, I received an email with a file attachment labeled Evidence Exhibit AMP4. My hands trembled as I opened it, Carla and Lopez sitting beside me. The footage was grainy, shot from a distance, and it showed King in what appeared to be a confrontation with another dog at the park. The angle was awkward, and the scene was chaotic, but there was no mistaking the way it had been edited. This is fake, Carla said immediately. Look at the cuts. They've spliced different clips together to make it look like King is attacking. She paused the video, pointing to a timestamp in the corner. This part isn't even from the same day. Look at the shadows. The light changes halfway through. We had proof that the video was doctored, but exposing it wouldn't be enough. We needed to turn the tables on Hensley entirely, proving not only that his evidence was false, but that he had been orchestrating this campaign from the start. Lopez suggested calling in a professional video analyst to testify at the hearing, someone who could explain the manipulation in technical terms. Carla, meanwhile, began drafting a timeline of events to present to the council, showing how Hensley's actions had escalated over time. As the hearing approached, I felt a strange combination of dread and determination. Hensley had played his hand, and now it was up to us to dismantle it piece by piece. The night before the hearing, I sat in my living room with King curled up at my feet. The neighborhood felt quiet for the first time in weeks, but I knew it was the calm before the storm. I stroked King's fur, drawing strength from his steady presence. We're going to get through this, I whispered, more to myself than to him. We're going to win. The morning of the hearing arrived with a chill in the air, the kind that seeped through even the thickest coat. I barely slept the night before, my mind racing with every possible outcome. By the time Carla and Lopez arrived to drive me to the council chambers, I had gone over our case a dozen times in my head. The room was smaller than I expected, with rows of chairs facing a long wooden table where the council members sat. A projector screen had been set up to display evidence. Hensley was already there, his face a mask of smug confidence. He gave me a curt nod as I walked in, his expression saying, "This is my game, and you've already lost." King wasn't allowed in the building, so Carla stayed with him outside while Lopez joined me. I took a seat, clutching the folder of evidence we'd prepared. The hearing began with formalities, the council chair explaining the purpose of the meeting to determine whether King posed a threat to the community, and if so, whether action should be taken against me as his owner. Hensley went first, presenting his case with the kind of flair you'd expect from a seasoned manipulator. "This isn't personal," he began, his tone falsely magnanimous. "It's about ensuring the safety of our neighborhood. My goal has always been to protect our community, and unfortunately, Mr. Carter's dog has created an unsafe environment." He played the video, his expression smug as the distorted footage flickered across the screen. Gasps rippled through the small audience neighbors who had come to watch the proceedings, and I could see doubt creeping back into some of their faces. "That's King," Hensley continued, pointing to the screen. "And as you can see, his behavior is unpredictable and aggressive. This isn't the first incident, and it won't be the last if action isn't taken." When it was my turn, I stood slowly, forcing myself to meet the council members' eyes despite the lump in my throat. "Thank you for giving me the chance to respond," I began, my voice steady. "What you just saw may look damning at first glance, but it's not the truth. That video has been manipulated, and I can prove it." I handed a flash drive to the council chair, who loaded it onto the projector. The first clip I played was from the same day as Hensley's video, showing the unedited footage I'd recorded on King's leash camera. It was clear, calm, and completely contradicting the aggressive image Hensley had tried to paint. The second clip was an analysis from the video expert Carla had found. In it, the analyst pointed out the inconsistencies in Hensley's footage, highlighting the mismatched shadows, jerky edits, and overlapping audio that revealed it had been spliced together. By the time the video finished, the room was silent. "Mr. Carter's dog is not a danger to anyone," I said, addressing the council directly. "What you've seen here today is not evidence of a threat, it's evidence of a campaign of harassment. Mr. Hensley has been targeting me and my dog from the beginning, not because of any real concern, but because of his own prejudice." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the room. "This isn't just about King. It's about the kind of community we want to live in. Do we want to be a neighborhood that's torn apart by fear and lies, or one that stands together and supports each other?" After I finished, Carla stepped in as my final witness. She spoke eloquently about the changes she'd seen in the neighborhood since Hensley had arrived, describing how his actions had sown distrust and division. She ended with a powerful statement: "King represents everything Hensley fears: kindness, loyalty, and the ability to bring people together. That's why he's fighting so hard to tear them apart. But I think we're better than that. I think we can be a community again." Hensley tried to rebut, but his confidence was slipping. The council members peppered him with questions about the video's authenticity, and he stumbled over his answers. It was clear he hadn't expected his evidence to be scrutinized so closely. One of the council members, a stern woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Mr. Hensley, it seems this situation is less about a dangerous dog and more about a personal vendetta. Do you have anything else to add?" Hensley's face turned red. "The footage speaks for itself," he muttered, but the conviction in his voice was gone. When the council adjourned to deliberate, the room buzzed with quiet conversations. Carla and Lopez joined me outside, where King waited patiently. "You did great," Carla said, squeezing my arm. "They saw the truth," Lopez nodded. Hensley looked ready to crumble in there. "I think this is it, but I couldn't relax just yet." The council's decision could go either way, and until it was final, the weight of uncertainty pressed down on me. After what felt like an eternity, the counsel returned. The chair stood, her expression serious, but not unkind. After reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony from both parties, we find that the accusations against King are unfounded. The video presented by Mr. Hensley was determined to be manipulated and cannot be considered credible. Therefore, no action will be taken against Mr. Carter or his dog. The room erupted in applause, and I felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought me to tears. As the hearing adjourned, Hensley stormed out, his face twisted with fury. But the neighbors who had doubted me now approached with smiles and apologies, their warmth washing away weeks of isolation. King wagged his tail, oblivious to the drama, but happy to see so many friendly faces. As we left the council chambers, I felt a renewed sense of hope. The fight wasn't just about proving King's innocence, it was about reclaiming the soul of our neighborhood. And in that moment, I knew we'd won more than a hearing. The hearing may have been over, but the conflict with Hensley didn't vanish overnight. As the days passed, it became clear he wasn't ready to let go of his grudge. For a while, it was subtle sideways glares from across the street, pointed whispers when he walked past neighbors who had supported me at the hearing. But then, things began to escalate. It started with small acts of vandalism. My mailbox was knocked over one night, the screws stripped from its base. Then, someone egged my front door while I was out walking King. Each incident left me more uneasy than the last. I had no proof it was Hensley, but I didn't need it. It had his fingerprints all over it. Carla urged me to report the incidents to the police. "You can't let this slide," she said, pacing my living room. "The more you ignore him, the bolder he'll get." She wasn't wrong. I filed a report, but without evidence, there wasn't much the authorities could do. The tension reached a boiling point late one evening. I was sitting on my porch with King at my feet, enjoying the quiet after a long day, when I noticed a figure lingering across the street. At first, I thought it was one of the neighbors taking a late-night stroll, but as the minutes ticked by, it became clear they weren't moving. I squinted into the darkness, my heart pounding. It was Hensley. "What do you want?" I called out, my voice steady but sharp. He didn't respond. Instead, he crossed the street slowly, stopping just at the edge of my yard. King lifted his head, his ears pricking up in alertness. "I just wanted to see how you're doing," Hensley said finally, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like you're the neighborhood hero now." I stood, keeping my distance. "Go home, Hensley. You've caused enough trouble." "Trouble?" He chuckled darkly. "You think this is trouble? You haven't seen anything yet." Before I could respond, King let out a low growl. It wasn't like him. He was usually calm, even in tense situations. But something about Hensley's presence set him on edge. "Control your dog," Hensley sneered, taking a deliberate step closer. "Wouldn't want him to get into any accidents." The thinly veiled threat sent a jolt of anger through me. "Leave." Now he stared at me for a long moment, his smirk fading. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The next morning, Carla and Lopez came over to check on me after hearing about the encounter. "This is getting out of hand," Lopez said, pacing the living room. "He's not just trying to intimidate you anymore, he's trying to provoke you. He wants you to snap," Carla added. "If you lose your temper, it'll give him exactly what he needs to turn the neighborhood back against you." They were right, but staying calm was getting harder with each passing day. I felt like a storm was building, and Hensley was determined to be at the center of it. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself was shifting. The hearing had exposed Hensley's manipulations, and many of his former allies had distanced themselves from him. But there were still a few holdouts, people who clung to his narrative, either out of fear or stubbornness. One of them was George, the neighbor who had tipped off Lopez about the video. Though he'd helped us before, he'd grown quiet since the hearing, avoiding eye contact whenever we passed on the street. One afternoon, I decided to approach him. "George," I called out as he watered his front lawn. He froze, then turned slowly, his expression guarded. "What do you want?" "I just wanted to thank you," I said, keeping my tone neutral, "for telling Lopez about the video. It helped more than you know." George shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. "I didn't do it for you," he muttered. I didn't want to be part of something like that." "That's fair," I said. "But you've seen what Hensley is capable of. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants, and this neighborhood will pay the price." For a moment, I thought George might argue, but instead, he sighed heavily. "I'll think about it," he said before turning back to his hose. As the week went on, the tension in the neighborhood grew palpable. People were choosing sides, and while many were beginning to rally around me, others remained silent, their loyalty to Hensley unshaken. Then, one evening, Carla called me, her voice tinged with urgency. "You need to come to the park," she said. "Now, what's going on?" I asked, already grabbing my coat. "There's a meeting. Hensley's called it, and it's bad. He's trying to turn people against you again." When I arrived, the scene was exactly as Carla had described. Hensley stood at the center of a small crowd, his voice carrying through the crisp night air. "I'm not saying we should force him out," he was saying, his tone measured but insidious. "But we have to protect our community. If he won't leave willingly, we'll make it clear he's not welcome here." "Are you serious?" Carla interrupted, stepping forward with me and Lopez by her side. "You're still trying to divide us after everything that's happened?" Hensley's eyes narrowed as he spotted me. "Ah, here he is. The man of the hour." I stepped forward, meeting his gaze. "I'm not going anywhere, Hensley. This is my home, whether you like it or not," the crowd murmured, and for the first time, I saw doubt flicker across his face. The tide was turning, but the battle wasn't over yet. The tension in the park was suffocating. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, caught between Hensley's rhetoric and the simple truth I had just stated. Carla and Lopez flanked me like loyal allies, their presence a reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. Hensley smirked, but the cracks in his facade were beginning to show. "You can play the victim all you want," he said, his voice sharp, "but the fact is, you've brought nothing but trouble to this neighborhood. The hearing may have gone your way, but that doesn't mean we have to live with you here." His words were meant to incite, to stoke the flames of fear and resentment he'd carefully nurtured. But this time, the crowd didn't respond the way he expected. "I think we've had enough of your lies," Hensley, Carla said, stepping forward with fire in her voice. "You've been manipulating this neighborhood from the moment you moved in. The only person causing trouble here is you." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Mrs. Green, who had been standing near the back, raised her hand. "I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm tired of this nonsense. This neighborhood used to be peaceful until Hensley started stirring up drama. I think it's time we moved on." The momentum was shifting, but Hensley wasn't ready to back down. "Oh, please," he snapped. "Don't act like I'm the bad guy here. I'm the only one looking out for this community. Do you really want to live in a place where dangerous dogs and their irresponsible owners run the show?" He pointed at me, his voice rising. "How many more incidents before something serious happens? Are you all willing to take that risk?" I stepped forward, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Enough." The crowd fell silent as I met Hensley's glare. "We've been over this, Hensley. You tried to use a fake video to smear me. You tried to paint me and my dog as threats when the truth is, we've done nothing wrong. And you know it." I turned to the crowd, my voice rising with conviction. "I moved into this neighborhood because I believed it was a place where people looked out for each other, where we could build a community. But Hensley has turned it into a battleground. This isn't about safety or standards, it's about control. And I think we all know who the real problem is here." The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Lopez stepped up beside me. "He's right. Hensley's been playing all of us. It's time we stopped letting him call the shots." One by one, neighbors began to speak out. "I signed that petition because I was scared," admitted George, stepping forward hesitantly. "But now I see that I was wrong. I shouldn't have let Hensley manipulate me. I've lived here for 20 years, Mrs. Connolly said, her voice trembling, "and I've never seen anything like this before. We used to be a community. Now we're just divided." Hensley's face turned red, his confidence unraveling. "You're all making a mistake," he said, his voice growing desperate. "You'll regret this. Mark my words. Enough, Hensley, Mrs. Green said firmly. We've had enough of your bullying. It's time for you to leave us alone. For the first time, Hensley looked truly shaken. He glanced around the crowd, searching for support, but the faces that once stood behind him were now filled with doubt or outright defiance. As the crowd began to disperse, Carla turned to me with a smile. I think that's the beginning of the end for him. I hope so, I said, though I couldn't shake the feeling that Hensley wasn't finished yet. That night, I found myself sitting on the porch again, King at my side. The quiet was different this time, less heavy, more hopeful. The park confrontation had been a turning point, but I knew the true test of the neighborhood's unity was still to come. Lopez's voice echoed in my mind. He's desperate now. Desperate people do reckless things. The next day, my fears were confirmed. I woke to find a letter taped to my front door. The paper was crumpled, the handwriting rushed and angry. You may have won the hearing, but this isn't over. Watch your back. I showed the letter to Carla and Lopez, their faces darkening with concern. This is a threat, Carla said, her voice tight. We need to report it. I will, I said. But it's not just about me anymore. Hensley's poisoned this neighborhood for long enough. It's time to take a stand. We decided to hold a final neighborhood meeting, this time with a clear goal, to formally address Hensley's behavior and vote on measures to ensure accountability. It would be the ultimate test of whether the community was ready to move forward or whether his influence still held sway. The night of the meeting, the park pavilion was packed. Neighbors who had stayed silent before now stepped forward, ready to speak their minds. We can't let fear dictate how we live, Mrs. Green said passionately. It's time we took our neighborhood back. Even George spoke up, his voice steady despite the tension. Hensley doesn't represent us. It's time we made that clear. When Hensley arrived, his face was a mask of barely concealed fury. He tried to interrupt, but the crowd wasn't having it. This is about all of us, I said, standing before the group. About what kind of community we want to be. Hensley has had his say, but now it's time for us to decide. The vote was unanimous. The neighborhood would move forward with new rules to promote transparency and cooperation, effectively dismantling the influence Hensley had wielded for so long. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. He stormed out without a word, leaving the pavilion buzzing with a renewed sense of hope and unity. In the days following the neighborhood meeting, the atmosphere began to shift. For the first time in weeks, the cul-de-sac felt lighter, as though the collective weight of fear and division was finally lifting. Neighbors who had once avoided me now waved as I walked King, and conversations that had been tense or non-existent were beginning to flow again. But Hensley wasn't gone yet. The final blow came one stormy night, when a loud crash outside startled me awake. King barked furiously, racing to the front door as I threw on a coat and stepped out into the cold rain. My heart sank as I saw what had happened. The wooden fence that bordered my property had been smashed, jagged planks lying in the mud. At first, I thought it was an accident, perhaps a fallen branch, or the result of the storm, but then I saw the tire marks. Someone had deliberately driven into it. I clenched my fists, anger coursing through me. There was no question who was behind this. By morning, word of the vandalism had spread. Carla and Lopez arrived within an hour, shaking their heads in disbelief as they surveyed the damage. This is insane, Carla said. He's completely unhinged. You have to call the police, Lopez added. This isn't just harassment anymore. It's criminal. I filed another report, but the officer who came to take my statement seemed hesitant. Without direct evidence linking Hensley to the act, it would be difficult to pursue legal action. Keep an eye out, the officer said as he left, and let us know if you notice anything suspicious. That afternoon, I decided to confront Hensley directly. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't let him think he could get away with this. Carla and Lopez insisted on coming with me, and together we walked to his house. Hensley opened the door with a smug smile, as though he'd been expecting me. "Oh, Mr. Carter," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "What can I do for you?" "You know why I'm here," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "This has gone far enough, Hensley. The fence, the threats it ends now, he shrugged, feigning innocence. I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe you should take better care of your property. Carla stepped forward, her eyes blazing. We know it was you. And so does the neighborhood. You think you can scare everyone into submission, but your time is up. Hensley's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. You're playing a dangerous game, he said, his tone low and threatening. You'd better watch yourself. As we walked away, Lopez muttered under his breath, he's cornered, and he knows it. That's why he's lashing out. He won't stop until he has no choice. Carla added, we need to make sure everyone sees him for who he really is. The neighborhood's new unity was tested that very evening when Hensley called an impromptu meeting at his house. It was a last-ditch effort to rally support, and while many of the neighbors refused to attend, a few curious souls went to see what he had to say. What they found was a man unraveling. He's gone full conspiracy mode, George reported to me afterward. He's saying you're out to destroy the neighborhood, that the hearing was rigged, that the new community rules are some kind of plot to take away our rights. Did anyone believe him? I asked, my stomach twisting. George shook his head. Not really. Most people just looked uncomfortable. But he's still got a few people wrapped around his finger. The final showdown came the next morning. As I was walking King, Hensley stormed into the street, shouting loud enough to draw the attention of nearby neighbors. Why don't you just leave? He yelled, his face red with rage. You don't belong here, and you never will. I stopped in my tracks, my grip tightening on King's leash. Around us, doors opened, and neighbors stepped onto their porches, watching the scene unfold. This isn't about me, is it? I said, keeping my voice steady. It's about you. You can't stand the idea of losing control. Hensley took a step closer, his fists clenched. You're nothing but trouble, Carter. You and that dog have ruined everything. Before I could respond, Mrs. Green stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Enough, Hensley, she shouted. We're tired of your nonsense. You've been bullying this neighborhood for months, and we're done putting up with it. One by one, other neighbors joined her. We don't want your hate here anymore, Carla said firmly. This isn't your neighborhood to control, Lopez added. Even George spoke up, his voice wavering but determined. You're the problem, Hensley, not Carter, not King. You. Hensley looked around, his face a mask of disbelief. The crowd had turned against him, their unity finally breaking his hold over the neighborhood. With a snarl, he turned and stormed back to his house, slamming the door behind him. For the first time, the street felt truly quiet. That evening, a group of neighbors gathered at my house. They helped repair the fence, laughing and chatting as they worked. The sense of community that had been missing for so long was finally beginning to return. King trotted among them, his tail wagging, as if sensing the shift in the air. As the sun set, I sat on the porch, watching the neighborhood come back to life. Carla and Lopez joined me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a genuine sense of peace. This isn't just about you and King anymore, Carla said. It's about all of us. And we're stronger now, thanks to you. I looked down at King, scratching behind his ears. Thanks to him too, I said with a smile. The day after the confrontation on the street, a strange quiet settled over the neighborhood. Hensley's absence was palpable. His usual routines of prowling the sidewalks and glaring at neighbors had ceased. But it wasn't over yet. A storm always calms before its final fury. Lopez called me that morning, his voice tense. Hensley's house is unusually dark. No lights, no movement. I think he's planning something. Carla chimed in later with her own report. He's been unusually quiet, but don't let your guard down. He's lost his public face. He might act out in private now. Their warnings were valid, but I wasn't going to live in fear anymore. The neighborhood had rallied behind me, and the momentum was on our side. However, there was a lingering sense of dread that Hensley's endgame wasn't far off. That evening, a group of neighbors gathered at my house. It wasn't planned. People just showed up, bringing warm food, stories, and a collective sense of unity. I brought extra nails and a hammer, George said, holding up a tool bag. Thought we could reinforce that fence while we're here. Mrs. Green arrived with cookies and hot cocoa, declaring that no neighborhood project would be complete without snacks. Even a few neighbors who had stayed silent throughout the conflict joined in, eager to rebuild more than just a fence. As the work continued, laughter and light conversation filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had plagued us for so long. King wandered happily among the group, his tail wagging as children petted him and adults handed him scraps of leftover turkey. But as the evening wore on and the crowd began to thin, Lopez pulled me aside. "We need to be ready for whatever Hensley has planned," he said, his tone serious. "I know," I replied, "but tonight reminded me what we're fighting for. He's losing his grip, and he knows it. That makes him dangerous." The next morning, I awoke to chaos. Carla called first, her voice frantic. "He's done it, Carter. He's made his final move. What happened?" I asked, already pulling on my jacket. "You need to see for yourself." When I stepped outside, I saw it immediately. A series of crude signs staked along the edge of my yard, each one scrawled with hateful messages. Some targeted me, others King, and a few had the same veiled threats Hensley had made the night of the storm. Neighbors were already gathering, murmuring in shock and anger. "This is too far," Mrs. Green said, her hands trembling as she read the signs. "This has to stop." Carla and Lopez arrived moments later, both visibly angry. "We're taking these down," Carla said firmly. "Not yet," I replied, surprising even myself. "Let everyone see them first. Let them see exactly who Hensley is." Lopez nodded in understanding. "You're right. This isn't just about us anymore, it's about the whole neighborhood." By mid-morning, nearly everyone in the cul-de-sac had seen the signs. For those who hadn't yet taken a side, the display was the final straw. Conversations broke out on porches and sidewalks, neighbors openly condemning Hensley's actions. "I can't believe I ever supported him," George said, shaking his head. "This isn't what we stand for," another neighbor added. "We can't let this continue." Hensley's downfall came later that afternoon. He emerged from his house, expecting perhaps to find a divided neighborhood, or at least a few allies. Instead, he found an entire community standing together, united in their outrage. "You've gone too far, Hensley," Mrs. Green said, stepping forward with surprising boldness. "You don't speak for us anymore," George added. Hensley's face twisted with rage. "You're all fools," he spat. "You think this is over? You think siding with him changes anything?" "It changes everything," I said, stepping forward. "This neighborhood isn't yours to control anymore. It belongs to all of us, and we're done living in fear." For the first time, Hensley had no response. The crowd's silence wasn't one of uncertainty, but of collective condemnation. He turned and stormed back into his house, slamming the door behind him. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to rebuild not just fences or relationships, but the very sense of trust that Hensley had tried to destroy. The hateful signs were taken down, replaced with cheerful holiday decorations that neighbors worked together to hang. The cul-de-sac sparkled with string lights and wreaths, a testament to the resilience of the community. A week later, a moving truck appeared in front of Hensley's house. The news spread quickly. He was leaving. No one knew where he was going, and no one cared to ask. As the truck pulled away, I stood on my porch with King, watching as the neighborhood gathered to celebrate. For the first time in months, the air felt light, free of the tension that had once gripped us. That evening, we held a block party under the twinkling lights, sharing food, stories, and laughter. Mrs. Green raised a toast. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice strong and clear. "And to the people who remind us what community really means." As glasses clinked and cheers erupted, I looked down at King, who was happily chewing on a treat. "This is what we fought for," I whispered, scratching behind his ears. King wagged his tail, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I knew we were home. The block party felt like the true turning point, not just for me, but for everyone in the neighborhood. As music played and children ran between tables, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come. The cul-de-sac, once torn apart by fear and mistrust, was alive with laughter and light. Neighbors who had been strangers for years were now sharing stories and passing plates of cookies. Even those who had been hesitant to take a stand against Hensley were here, their presence a quiet apology. Carla and Lopez stood near the fire pit, roasting marshmallows and chatting with Mrs. Green, who looked 10 years younger without the burden of tension weighing her down. "This is what it's all about," Lopez said, catching my eye and raising a cup of cider in a silent toast. The next morning, I woke to the sound of King's tail thumping against the side of the bed. It was a simple sound, but it carried a weight of peace I hadn't felt in months. Our morning walk was different that day. Neighbors waved and stopped to chat, their smiles genuine. Mrs. Connolly, who had once been too afraid to speak up, came out to offer King a homemade dog treat. "He's a good boy," she said, patting his head. "We're lucky to have both of you here." Over the following weeks, the neighborhood continued to heal. The hateful signs and whispered divisions were replaced by acts of kindness. A few families who had moved away during the conflict even sent letters expressing regret for leaving, inspired by stories of how the community had come together. The neighborhood committee, once a source of contention, became a symbol of collaboration. Carla spearheaded new initiatives, including monthly block cleanups and seasonal events. Lopez, ever the organizer, took on the role of treasurer, ensuring that every project had the resources it needed. As for me, I found myself stepping into a leadership role I hadn't anticipated. At Carla's insistence, I started hosting informal dog days at the park where neighbors could bring their pets to socialize. What began as a simple gathering quickly grew into a beloved tradition, further solidifying the bonds we'd worked so hard to rebuild. One evening, as I was tidying up after a dog day event, George approached me. "Hey," he said, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Got a minute?" "Of course," I replied, setting down a bag of tennis balls. He shifted awkwardly before meeting my gaze. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything, for signing that petition, for not speaking up sooner. I let Hensley get in my head, and I regret it." His apology was earnest, and I could see the weight of guilt in his eyes. "Thank you," I said, extending a hand. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. And I'm glad you're part of this neighborhood." He shook my hand, relief softening his features. "Thanks, Carter. I'll do better from now on." As Christmas approached, the neighborhood came together to decorate the cul-de-sac. Wreaths adorned doorways, lights twinkled in the trees, and the park became a winter wonderland complete with a towering fir draped in ornaments. On Christmas Eve, the neighborhood held its first caroling event, a tradition Carla suggested to replace the negativity Hensley had left behind. Families gathered, their voices mingling in harmony as we walked from house to house. When we reached my home, I stepped onto the porch with King, who wagged his tail enthusiastically as the carolers sang Silent Night. The scene was so serene, so filled with joy, that it brought tears to my eyes. Later that night, I sat by the fire with King curled up at my feet, reflecting on everything we had endured. Hensley's departure had left a mark, but it was one that reminded us of the importance of standing up for what was right. The neighborhood had learned a hard lesson about the dangers of division and the strength of unity. For me, the journey had been transformative. I'd arrived in this neighborhood looking for a home, but I'd found something much deeper, a community worth fighting for. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the arrival of Christmas Day, I raised my glass in a silent toast to the journey that had brought us here. "To new beginnings," I whispered, scratching behind King's ears. He wagged his tail in response, his contentment mirroring my own. Together, we had faced the worst and come out stronger. The neighborhood, once fractured, was whole again. And in that quiet moment, with the fire crackling softly and the snow beginning to fall outside, I knew one thing for certain: we were finally home. If you enjoyed this story, take a moment to reflect on the power of unity and standing up for what's right. It's not always easy, but when we come together, we can overcome even the toughest challenges. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire and remind us of what truly matters. And if this story resonated with you, Share it with someone who could use a little hope and encouragement this season. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.